Hello, and welcome to another module in our Preaching Powerful Bible-Based Sermons seminar. For today's module, we are going to do an overview on the 10 stages of sermon preparation. In retrospect, we probably should have begun with this seminar in order to help you see the grander scheme of things, but that is part of the learning process, and so I have recorded this presentation myself to send out to you all so that you can see how each stage bleeds into the other. If you've not done so already, I would highly encourage you to go ahead and visit either my YouTube channel or my blog, which I use to help you live a meaningful life. Now, to be honest, at the time of this recording, both of these are rather small. They are both in their infancy, but over time I hope to grow them to be a greater blessing for God's kingdom in this world. Well, as we look at the 10 stages of sermon preparation, I want to begin by warning you that today's presentation is really going to come at you like a fire hose, right? You're really going to feel as if you are drowning in the wealth of information coming. I just want you to know that you can relax, you can sit back, and do not get overwhelmed. The purpose of this is to show you how each stage feeds into the other. And as you understand the greater picture of everything, you can come to understand a little bit better each of our modules, because you're no longer just looking at the parts, you are now able to look at the whole. So the first stage of our sermon is going to be choosing your passage, right? Very simply, you can't have a sermon without a Bible passage. There's an old joke that says, if you want to make rabbit stew, step one, you got to catch the rabbit, right? You can't have rabbit stew if you don't have the rabbit. Now, of course, you can always choose a passage willy-nilly, but I would not recommend that you do so. Actually, what I would recommend for you is that you plan a year's preaching ahead of time. Now, I don't want to go into this for too long, but the reason that you do that is because it allows you to give the congregation a balanced, biblical diet. What I would recommend is that you work with your pastor and you see what series are they preaching through this next year, and find out what series you can get involved in, and then you would be able to preach along with them. That gives you time to really study your passage, and it also gives you the time necessary to really flush out the sermon to be a benefit to the congregation. Also, the reason why it is important to choose your passage is that your passage length will determine your sermon length. Very simply, the longer the passage is, the more shallow your preaching has to be. And what I mean by shallow, I don't mean that it's shallow in wisdom. What I mean is that you cannot go as deep in all the different aspects of your passage, right? Because if you're preaching on 20 verses, you're not going to be able to look at each verse as deeply as you would otherwise. However, if your passage is, let's say, 2 or 3 verses, well, now you have something much easier to really dig in deep. So really, the longer you go, the more breadth you're going to do. But the shorter your passage, the more depth you're going to do. So you want to choose your passage ahead of time, because really it will determine your sermon's length. The next step after you have been able to choose your passage is to begin studying your passage. Now, as we already saw in one of our other modules on studying your Bible passage, this really is a 3-step process. You want to begin with an overview reading. Now, the overview reading helps you to understand where your passage is in the role of the book. It also helps you understand the historical context of your book. Now, I've already sent out to you all a resource list, and I recommended to you to use what's called the New Testament Transline Bible for this step. What that resource has done is it has provided a literal translation from Greek into English, and it has outlined the entire New Testament so you can see where each verse is in the thought process of the author. And really, it makes this step so much easier. And on Amazon right now, used copies of the 2 volumes, they're going for about $25 a piece. And I hold mine like they are going out of style because last I knew, the volumes are no longer in print. And so I'd recommend getting them as quick as you can because once they're gone, they're gone. And it is a wonderful resource to have. That is the New Testament Transline Bible. Well, the second step you want to go through as you study your passage is you want to do an in-depth reading. And really that kind of comes in 2 stages if you remember. You want to, number 1, isolate your keywords, and then you want to study those keywords. And I can guarantee you that if you do this step the way it should be done, you are going to have more than enough to preach come Sabbath. In all honesty, you're going to be leaving a lot out when you get there, and we'll show you more about that when we get to the stage on outlining your sermon. The next thing you want to do as you study your passage is do what we call a dialogical reading. And really you're asking yourself, from my own study, what does other commentaries say about that? What do other Seventh-day Adventist writers say about that? What does Ellen White say about that? And I would recommend to you, of course, to use the Seventh-day Adventist Bible Commentary. I'd also recommend that you go on to the Biblical Research Institute, go onto their website, because the Adventist Church has provided tons of articles on a multitude of topics as well as passages, and you can get a very good scholarly perspective on your passage. I would also recommend at this step that you spend time looking at the Adventist Theological Society papers. Those are free online. Or if you want to go with a more lay version, they have a lay version called Perspective Digest. And if you go ahead and look at both of those, the Biblical Research Institute and Ellen White and the Seventh-day Adventist Commentary, you're going to have more than enough to really bring your passage to life. So we want to do the overview reading, an in-depth reading, and a dialogical reading. Next, we want to find what is called the exegetical idea. Now, we've already had one of our presenters, Dr. Judd Lake, teach on finding the exegetical idea, so I don't want to cover everything that he's already looked at. What I do want to say is that the Bible has not been written roughshod. In other words, the Bible writers were not just randomly throwing ideas together. When they wrote their passage, God gave them a specific idea in their minds, and they were to communicate that idea to us. Your duty as a faithful, Bible-based preacher is to discover that original idea. And as we saw in that presentation, the exegetical idea is formed with 2 different things, what we call the subject and what we call the complement. And to keep it very simple, the subject can always be stated in the form of a question. Really, it is, what is the Bible author talking about? And the complement is very simply the answer to that question. It seems really complicated at first when you are first introduced to this idea, but the more you practice, as with anything, it really becomes second nature to you. And I want to just provide you a few examples so you can see what we are talking about. So here is a very simple example with modern day things for you to understand the subject and the complement. Let's say you're writing an essay, okay? And the subject of your essay is simple. Why should you own a dog? Do you notice how that's formed in a question, right? The entire essay is about making the case on why you should own a dog. The complements then are going to be the answer to that question. Well, you should own a dog because they are cute, they are cuddly, and they are good companions. Okay? I know that's really mundane, like it's not gonna rock anyone's boat, it's not going to be this in depth, wise thing that blows everyone's mind, but this is a very simple way of understanding the exegetical idea. The subject is always the question that the author is addressing, and the complement is their answer to the question they are addressing. Well, let's take a look at an actual Bible passage to see what this looks like. James 1 verses 2 through 4. Now this, I believe, is from the New King James Version, though it may be from the New International. I forgot what source I copied this from. But James 1 verse 2 through 4 says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." So we want to begin by asking ourselves, what question is James addressing in this passage? Now, we all may want to say, well, he's talking about joy. But it's a little more specific than that, isn't it? It's not just any joy. It's not, the joy you should have when your baby is born. We may say, well, he's talking about steadfastness. Well, is he talking about any kind of steadfastness? Is he talking about the steadfastness that you go through when you're, trying to have a hard work day and finish your work on time? Well, no, not really. He's not just talking about joy. He's not just talking about steadfastness. He's talking about something specific. And I would submit that when you look at the passage in its entirety, he is answering this question: why should you be joyful when you face trials? Now we got it. Because all of the parts of this passage fit underneath this question. In fact, where I come from, when we look at this, we're going to say, now that would preach, right? That would preach, because you're preaching in the Bible's authority. The question that James is answering is, why should you be joyful when you face trials? And his answer are the complements. Why should you be joyful when you face trials? Because during trials, your faith is tested. When your faith is tested, it produces steadfastness, and steadfastness makes you perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Now we know what he's talking about. Now we see what we can address. Now we can meet our congregation where they are at. Now we have the makings of a sermon. So putting this all together, we would put the exegetical idea as this: you should be joyful when you face trials, because during trials your faith is tested. This testing produces steadfastness, and steadfastness makes you perfect and complete. That's our sermon. That's our passage. That is what we're going to be focusing on as we build things from here. Now I want to pause and let you know how important the exegetical idea is. The exegetical idea is what roots you to the Bible's authority. When you get up there and you preach, you cannot preach in your authority. You do not have anything to offer the congregation. At the very least, you don't have anything better than God to offer the congregation, right? So you want to find the exegetical idea because it roots you to the Bible's authority. It roots you to what God was saying when he inspired the Bible authors, and that's what you want to communicate to the people that you are preaching to. The next thing is that the exegetical idea dictates what happens in every other stage of the sermon from here. So you can think of it like when NASA launches a missile, all right? Maybe not a missile, maybe that's a bad way of saying it. When they go to launch one of their space shuttles, okay? If they are just a few inches off in the beginning, the shuttle will never make it where it needs to go. Just a few inches wrong in the beginning will often have catastrophic consequences in the end. That is the same with your exegetical idea. When you get it right, the entire process becomes beautiful and God glorifying. But if you get the wrong exegetical idea, then the conclusion where you ultimately have your sermon, it is not going to be speaking with the power and the authority of God. So you want to do whatever you can to get the exegetical idea right. That's stage 3. Moving on to stage 4. Stage 4 is when we enhance the exegetical idea. And really this happens by going through 3 different questions. We ask ourselves, what does this mean? In other words, in the exegetical idea, what do we need to explain? We ask, is it true? In other words, when I look at this exegetical idea, is there anything in it I might have to prove? Is there something in it the congregation may not be willing to accept? Is there something they may struggle with? Is there something I have to prove when I preach? And then lastly, really what difference does this make, right? How do we apply it? How do we apply it to someone's life? Well, if we go back and we look at our James passage, we can quickly take this through the 3 questions and we can see what things we would have to enhance when we get to the part of writing our sermon. Well, let's begin with that first one. What does it mean? What do I need to explain? Well, really, if you want to do this passage justice, you're going to have to explain what is meant by joy. Okay? You're going to want to explain what we mean by trials. You are going to need to explain what is meant by steadfastness. And you're going to want to explain what we mean by being perfect and complete. And I want to pause here and go back to, do you remember stage 2? In stage 2, you're to study your passage. And part of that was to isolate the key words. And if you're looking at our PowerPoint now, you should notice all of these are the key words, right? Without these key words, you cannot understand what's happening in this passage. And so your study then is going to come out now, and you will be able to explain these words adequately to your congregation when you are preaching. Well, looking back at our passage, what in here would we have to prove? How I always do this is I like to ask the question, is there something in this passage that a member of mine will take issue with? Or is there something in this passage that will make them stumble? And the answer to that helps me answer, is there something I need to prove? And I think there is some things that we need to talk about if we are going to preach this adequately. We need to prove, how do trials strengthen our faith, right? Because you're going to be preaching to the real world, and people are going to say, well, I know, Uncle Terry, who went through a hard time, and the trial didn't strengthen his faith. The trial broke his faith, right? He got to a hard time and he left the church. So you're going to need to be able to prove that trials, when used correctly, do in fact strengthen your faith. And if you do not address that in your sermon, people are going to walk away with doubts. Now, to be fair, you can't stop every wrong assumption, but you need to try to at least get to the big ones. You also need to prove the following. As I said, what about people who leave the faith during difficult periods of life? I guess I got a little ahead of myself there in the presentation. But really, if you do not deal with this, there will be people in the pews who walk away and don't agree with what you said. So you need to make sure you go through these things. What needs to be proved? Is it true? And then the last one is, what difference does this make in life? How do we apply it? So in your sermon, you're going to want to cover, how does one actually gain this joy? You want to cover, how can you remain steadfast? You want to cover, what should we do when we feel too weak to continue? These are all very real things that we go through. And if you are not focusing on these, people will not know how to apply the passage to their lives. Now, you may go through these 3 questions and have completely different answers than me. And that is actually okay. But what matters is that you go through these 3 questions and that you come up with the answers, because those questions are what you are going to answer when you write your sermon later. Now we move on to stage 5. And Dr. Lake covered this a little during his presentation, and I'm so glad that he did, because he really showed us how the exegetical idea becomes the homiletical idea. And by him showing you that, it really makes this part of the presentation easier. To keep it simple, the homiletical idea should be a short and pithy saying that will help people remember the point of your sermon. Okay? I like to think of these as modern day proverbs. Okay? Really, if you want to understand how to write a homiletical idea, this is something I've developed myself. It helps me. Hopefully it'll help you. It's this. If I was to take this entire sermon and put it down as a proverb, like that you would see in the Bible, what would it be? And then that proverb becomes what I repeat throughout the sermon. When I was going through James 1 verse 4 through 2, 2 through 4, and I was preaching it to my congregation, Allstate was running a bunch of commercials saying, with Allstate, you're in good hands. And so that became my sermon. That was my sermon proverb, my sermon homiletical idea, or as Dr. Lake called it, your bullet. And so throughout the sermon, I would tell them that you can have joy because you're in good hands. You can remain steadfast because you're in good hands. You can trust that you will get through this, and with that joy that your faith will grow because you're in good hands. Another one, when I was preaching from the book of Ecclesiastes, and I was talking about meditating on your own mortality, the proverb was, or the bullet, was, when you count your days, you make your days count. And that is something I repeated 4, 5, maybe 6 times throughout the whole sermon. And people were able to really grasp that. In fact, when I speak to my other congregations, the ones I had before I came here, where I currently am, they will still quote that to me. You're in good hands. When you count your days, you make your days count. To be honest, they probably don't remember every point of the sermon, but they remember the homiletical idea. And when they go through rough times, these homiletical ideas come to their minds. And that's the power of preaching a homiletical idea, a bullet. I like to call them a proverb. The next stage, now this is where you're going to start getting into the nitty-gritty of sermon writing. You want to determine, what is your sermon's purpose? Hopefully this has never happened to you when you're preaching, but I'm sure all of us have sat in the pews before, heard a preacher go on and on and on, and at the end be like, he said a lot of good things, but what on earth were they preaching about? Like, what was the purpose of all of that? Like, it was good, it was nice, but I'm not really sure I know what they were saying. Okay? You need to determine ahead of time what your sermon is going to accomplish. The purpose of your sermon states what you expect to happen in your hearers as a result of preaching your sermon. Okay? This is why it's very important to remember your exegetical idea. In stage 4, your exegetical idea stated what the truth of the passage was. In stage 6, it defines what that truth should accomplish. Right? As a result of preaching this sermon, my hearers should what? What should they do as a result of hearing your sermon? Well, to make it easy on you, there are 3 choices that you can make when it comes to choosing the purpose of your sermon. Now, to be clear, one of these will often dominate, but you will usually include a little bit of all 3. But usually, if you want to go laser focus, you will focus on one of these purposes. The first purpose is what we call cognitive. The second is affective. And the third is behavior. Okay? Cognitive refers to what they think. As a result of this sermon, I want them to think about trials differently. Or as a result of the sermon, I want them to feel joy when they go through trials. Or as a result of this sermon, I want them to remain steadfast when they go through trials. Do you see how all 3 of these went back to our passage, but they all accomplish a different purpose? Right? This is actually one way you can preach an entire sermon series through just one passage. Right? You can focus on one of these for each of your sermons, and bada bing, bada boom, you studied one passage and you have 3 sermons. Now that maximizes your time. That is being a good shepherd. Right? You went so deep in your passage, you can give people 3 sermons. Now, if you came to me as an elder and you said that, oh, let me tell you, you will be giving praise to Jesus that night in my prayers, because now I have an elder who really knows how to preach the Bible, right? And I usually refer to these, this is for my teaching years, I don't think cognitive, affective, and behavior. In my mind, I think head, heart, hand. What should they think? What should they feel? What should they do? Okay? Now, a few more examples from the same passage that we just covered earlier. As a result of this sermon, the congregation should understand how steadfastness perfects their faith. That's the head. As a result of this sermon, the congregation should feel the joy that comes with trials. That's heart. As a result of this sermon, the congregation should remain steadfast in faith while trials abound. That's the hand. That's the do. In fact, if you take these 3 purposes and combine them with the 3 purposes I did earlier, you got 6 sermons, right? You just took, 10, 15 hours. You studied one passage, and because you determined multiple purposes, you now have 6 sermons. When you learn to do this appropriately, it will so deepen your preaching, it will give you more than you can ever speak about, and it will truly change the lives of those sitting in the pews. And let's be honest, all of us are preaching because we want to bring God's kingdom to this world. We want lives to change. Well, if you want lives to change, you need to know your sermon's purpose. The next thing that you want to do is determine the outline. Okay? When you come here, you ask a very simple question. What outline format best communicates this passage's truth and accomplishes the sermon's purpose? Now, I'm not going to go too deep in all of these right now because really we need a whole lecture to do so. But to keep it simple, there are at least 3 types of outlines that I recommend you use as a beginning preacher. To be fair, there are a lot more than 3. But when you're just starting, you should learn these 3 first before you branch out. that is a deductive sermon, which basically you begin by telling them what you're going to talk about, and then you talk about it. So it might be something like this. Brothers and sisters, for today's sermon, we are going to be looking at the book of James, chapter 1, verse 2 through 4. In today's sermon, we are going to look at trials and how they abound in our lives. But James is going to teach us that during these trials we have joy. And we can have joy because this testing of our faith produces steadfastness. And if we allow steadfastness to do its work, we will be mature and complete. We will lack nothing. Let us begin by looking at that word, joy. Right? That's a deductive outline. You've just told your congregation what you're going to talk about, and step by step you go through it. The next one is inductive. Inductive sermons, really you use them by moving into the first point without telling the congregation exactly what you're going to talk about. These kind of sermons are perfect if you are dealing with an issue that will make people emotional. And if they become emotional too early, they will reject what you have to say. It's also really good to use when you are preaching on something controversial. So recently I gave a presentation, which is now going to be an article in the Adventist Review, on should Seventh-day Adventists vote. Now, I did not just come out and tell them my conclusion, because I know that is a controversial issue. Instead, I traced the historical development of Adventist thought, and only once they had all the evidence before them did I then tell them my conclusion. So you can think of it this way. A deductive sermon tells them your conclusion ahead of time. The inductive sermon waits until the end, and then you tell them your conclusion. The last version or outline you can use is what we call the inductive deductive sermon. It's obviously a hybrid between the two. This is used to get people through an emotional hump or to a controversial issue, but then build your case after. In my own experience, I preach more deductive sermons or inductive deductive. That's just my style. That's what I'm comfortable with. I can use the other, and as I just said, I have. But really, I find deductive or inductive deductive to be the best for beginners. Stage number 8 is once you have determined what kind of outline you want to use, you want to outline the sermon. Now, your congregation is not going to see the outline. The outline is not for them. The outline is there to help you. Because when you outline your sermon, it ensures unity in your sermon. Okay? It gives the sermon an appropriate sequence. In other words, it helps the sermon flow in such a way that the thought can be built in the minds of the listeners, so when you conclude the sermon, they have been given the full idea. Now, in his book, Invitation to Biblical Preaching, Don Sanukian gives a wonderful way to make sure that can happen. Unfortunately, that's beyond this presentation, but if you have the monetary means or your pastor owns the book, I would recommend getting the book Invitation to Biblical Preaching by Don Sanukian and going and looking at his chapter on outlining the flow of thought. And that will give you a perfect way to sequence your sermon to ensure the unity and the appropriate sequence. Also, when you outline your sermon, it helps you notice the weak spots, right? You start to realize, wow, I've really unpacked this word trials. I've really unpacked joy, but I've really done nothing for steadfastness. And so it helps you see the weak spots of your sermon first so you can fix them before you get to the pulpit. Next is it helps you preach without notes. Now, I'm a big advocate for preaching without your notes, okay? The reason for that is because when you preach without notes, it becomes natural. The sermon becomes you in a lot of ways. It flows out of you and into the congregation. The Spirit can work with you, and you can speak with power and authority, and you can improvise. You can speak without your notes. Now, that being said, I do know some top-notch preachers who preach with notes. Gordon Beats from, well, he was president of Southern Adventist University. I believe he has stepped down, and he was pastor of College of Church for quite some time. He is top-notch note preacher. But to be honest with you, even with notes, most people can't preach that good. And that's not a slap at anyone. With notes, I can't preach that good. It takes a certain kind of person to preach from the notes and make the dry bones live. And not a lot of people have that skill. So by outlining your sermon, it ingrains in your head the flow of your sermon so you can preach without your notes. So as you continue outlining your sermon, really you want to structure it according to your main point and the subpoint of the text. Continuing to use our passage, the main idea may be Christians should feel joy during trials because trials produce steadfastness. That's the first main idea. Well, the subpoint will be Christians are to be joyful during trials. The second subpoint is Christians, I got a little spelling error there, I'm sorry, are to be joyful during trials because trials produce steadfastness. And the third main point, Christians are to be joyful during trials because steadfastness perfects and completes faith. So just looking at the passage, outlining it, those are going to be the three main points of your sermon. Okay? And I would advocate that a deductive approach will be the best way to preach this specific sermon. So once you have your sermon outlined, you want to fill it in. Okay? Outlines as they are, well, they're not normally preachable. Okay? Some pastors can get up there and make them preachable, but I've sat in the pew long enough that I can tell when that happens, and very rarely does it come across good, right? You really want to spend time filling out your outline. And it's at this stage, this is the fun stage in my opinion. I like them all, but this one's really fun. It's at this stage that you get to plug in all the fruit of your scripture study. And so you can take what you've explained, what you've applied, what you made to feel, and you can add it to your sermon, and the glory to God that comes together. Now, when you fill out your sermon outline, I want to recommend, in the beginning, you follow a very simple format. I have taught this format multiple times to elders, and all of them have found this useful. All of them have found this a great way to begin. Not all of them stay here. Once they get better and they get more confident in their abilities, they go beyond here. But really, this helps you to come up with an A-grade sermon. It really does. You want to fill out your outline this way. My main point, number one, take time to explain it. Take time to illustrate it. And then take time to apply it. Do you remember earlier how I taught you to ask questions? The head, the heart, the hand? Look right here. It's the exact same thing. Explain it. That's the head. Illustrate it. Heart. Apply it. That's the hand. So all of those questions that you asked earlier, all those questions that you answered with your own study, go right here. You literally plug them and play them right in. And that's what helps you to condense the time of preparing a sermon, but ensuring that you fill out every section. All right? Now I want to take a moment to help you, because when you fill out your outline, it helps you determine your sermon's length. Now, I know that we've all been in this sermon before. We're like, oh my gosh, when, like, this is good, I'm liking it, but when is he going to end? When is she going to get done? When is this sermon going to be over? Well, I want to submit to you that really the reason they go over, now, yes, it can be the Holy Spirit. I've done that before myself. But most of the time it's because they did not fill out the outline appropriately. They did not take the diligent effort to keep their outline underneath a certain word count. My recommendation for you is, as you begin, you should not have a sermon larger than 2,500 words. Really, that's where you want to go. Depending how fast or slow you preach, this is going to take you between 25 to 35 minutes of sermon. Okay? So it's a good place to be. It really meets most congregations' needs, and it allows you to stay in your time frame. But what I really want to point out to you is that at first that seems like a lot of words, but it's really not. Because what I'm going to advise you to do is take those 25 words and then distribute them amongst your sermon in certain sections, and that will show you how much time you really have to preach each thing. Let me show you so you understand a little more what I'm talking about here, okay? Let's say you take all 2,500 words and you put them throughout your sermon. Well, you're probably going to take 300 words for your introduction. That's enough for a good story, a good quote, a little expansion, bring the people in. But really 300 words is as much as you're going to go with your introduction. For each of your main points, let's just assume you're preaching a 3-point sermon. I like 3-point sermons. It's just enough to really feel like you got some meat, but not so much you overwhelm the congregation. Well, if you do 3 points, each point would get about 635 words. And then you would conclude with 300 words. Now, you may think at this point, well, that's still a lot. Each point has 635 words. I really can make something with that. Well, to be honest with you, it doesn't go as far as you think it would. Because remember, earlier I recommended to you that you structure your sermon by main point, explain it, illustrate it, apply it. Well, if you do that, you can only have a certain amount of words for each point. So you will only have, let's say you distribute those 630 words evenly. You only would have 210 words to explain it, 210 words to illustrate it, and 210 words to apply it. That's not a lot of words. It's really not. 210 words, that's between 2 and 3 minutes of talking. So now you think about it. You have 2 to 3 minutes to really explain the point, 2 to 3 minutes to give an illustration, and 2 to 3 minutes to apply it. It's really not as much time as you think. And when you start looking at the word count, it really forces you to laser focus what you want to say. And so I can tell you when a preacher is up there and they spent 1,000 words explaining their first point, I already know they're not going to finish in time. They barely have time for a story and application at that point. So when you become diligent and you fill out your outline this way, you will be able to stay within time. You'll be able to cover all your material. It'll help you stay laser focused, and you can preach to the head, the hand, and the heart. The last stage is to write your introduction and your conclusion. Now you may wonder at this point, why am I waiting to the end to write the introduction and conclusion? Well, very simply, we leave this to the last step because you don't know what you're introducing or concluding until you have written the body of the sermon. Now, to be honest, in my own experience, I've done this, I still do. It will change the body of my sermon to a degree, and then that will in turn change my introduction and conclusion. So even though we're teaching these stages as as static, they happen dynamically as well. Okay? So we want, as we look at an effective introduction, There are really three things you want to accomplish with your introduction, and in our future module, we'll cover these more in depth. First, you want to capture your listener's attention. During your introduction, you want to uncover the listener's need. I think Andy Stanley, in his book Communicating for Change, talks about this perfectly. He says you want to introduce your sermon in such a way that by the time you get to your point, the people are begging you to answer. You've taken something that hurts them, that they're feeling pain in, you've brought it to light, and now they're itching for you to answer. I did this in just my last sermon I preached this previous week. I began by saying prayer changes the world. Brothers and sisters, do you believe that the most powerful force on this world is a righteous person on their knees? Now that captured the listener's attention. I had them. They were looking at me, they were nodding, they were smiling, amen, hallelujah. I had them. That's their attention. But then I began to uncover a need, a pain in their life. And I said to them, if we can have such power in prayer, then why do so many Christians lack power when they do pray? Oh, the congregation. I watched some people, they kind of sat on the edge of their pew. They looked up. There were people who were ignoring me a little bit at that point, but now I had them. Because we've all felt that pain. And in my introduction, I brought that up. And then I used multiple examples. I'm not going to do it now, I don't want to preach a whole sermon for you. But I used multiple examples to really enhance that pain. Because I wanted them to feel it so they could appreciate the sermon I was about to preach. The last goal you want to do in an effective introduction is to introduce the body of your sermon. Now that's more true for a deductive sermon. If you're going to do an inductive sermon, it transitions to the body of your sermon. Lastly, then you want to conclude. And a good conclusion, it really helps you land the plane. And that's a term that Haddon Robinson uses. When you conclude a sermon, you want to land the plane. How many times have we all sat there, the preacher said, in conclusion, and went on for 12 more minutes? That is not a conclusion. You failed. In my opinion, at that point, you failed. You did not conclude. That was not good. Your conclusion needs to give the listener a feeling of finality. The sermon is over. You can do this with an illustration, a summary, a prayer, an altar call. There are many ways to conclude the sermon, but you want to do it in a way that leaves the people feeling the sermon is over. The preacher has landed the plane. We all now know what the Bible says on this matter. So those are 10 stages of preaching powerful Bible-based sermons. And I know this was a large waterfall to take in. It may feel overwhelming, but remember that we are going to be releasing a module for each of these stages which goes in depth. Don't be overwhelmed. Don't try to do all stages immediately. Understand the bigger picture, and each time we do a module, you'll understand where it fits in the overarching flow of sermon preparation. Well, I thank you all for joining me today. If you would like to, please visit me over at my YouTube channel. That is Living with Purpose with Pastor Sean Kelly. Or you can visit me at my website, www.pastorseankelly.com. It's important to note my last name is Kelly, Kelley. Kelley. Well, I thank you all for being here today. I hope this overview is to your benefit. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may He bless you as you continue to feed your sheep. Take care, my friends.